Good evening. Welcome to the Law Awareness Week's CDC 2023 webinar. So this webinar is part of Law Awareness Weeks at CDC 2023. It is a collaboration between Pro Bono SG, the 5 Community Development Councils, National University of Singapore Faculty of Law, Singapore University of Social Sciences School of Law, Singapore Management University School of Law, the Singapore Corporate Counsel Association Pro Bono Chapter, and the Singapore Association of Social Workers, supported by the People's Association. My name's Philip Mann, and I am the host for this webinar. So today's webinar is Conflicts with Neighbours. Can this be resolved? First, if I could just go through some housekeeping matters with you. So today we will be using Pigeonhole Live for our Q&A session. You can submit your questions at any point during the webinar and also upvote on any questions that interest you. If you have a smartphone or a tablet with you, just launch your internet browser and enter www.pigeonhole.at into the address bar. Next, you can key in our event passcode, which is all capitals LAWCDC 2302. That's LAWCDC 2302, as shown on the slide. Alternatively, you can click on the link shared in the chat function to launch Pigeonhole Live on your device. If you are viewing this webinar on your desktop or laptop, you should receive an invitation to launch Pigeonhole. Please note that today's discussion is not intended to substitute any form of professional legal advice. If you have any specific legal advice questions, please consult a lawyer. So with that, I would like to introduce our panelists for today's webinar. We have Lei Teng and Sunil Rai. Lei Teng is a partner at Allen & Gledhill. She is head of the firm's Pro Bono program. Lei Teng is a principal mediator with the Singapore Mediation Centre, an international mediator with the Singapore International Mediation Centre, and a mediator with the Tribunal for the Maintenance of Parents and other organisations. She's mediated in community, family, and other disputes for almost 30 years. In 28 years of teaching at the Faculty of Law of the National University of Singapore, Lei Teng has developed numerous innovative and sustainable pro bono opportunities that provide high-quality legal services to individuals, families, communities, and also charities. Among these is a program with the Community and Dispute Resolution Tribunal of the state courts, where Lei Teng has gained some insight into neighbour disputes. Sunil Rai is a senior partner in Denton's Roddick's corporate practice group. He is co-head of the Venture Tech and Emerging Growth Companies practice group. Sunil Rai actively advises early-stage entities and venture-backed companies throughout their growth cycle, including issues related to incorporation, venture fundraising, corporate governance, commercial contracts, strategic partnerships, day-to-day operations, and M&A transactions. So he's been actively involved in pro bono activities for several years, including being a grassroots leader and also an active volunteer mediator for 15 years with the Community Mediation Centre and Community Association of Singapore. He is an accredited mediator with Singapore Mediation Centre and was appointed as Master Mediator by CMC in 2022. Sunil believes that mediation skills come in handy when doing negotiations and also in life matters. So Lei Teng, Sunil, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
So let's start. So in an ideal world, we would all get along with all of our neighbours and be in harmony with each other. However, there will be some points in many of our lives where we will come into some sort of conflict with our neighbours. There are many ways in which we would have conflict with our neighbours and how they can arise. And, as an example, you may find your neighbors to be too loud or play music which is not to your liking, or even their children are making noise that's not to your liking. You may find a leak from a neighbor's unit, which may be affecting your unit. Some neighbors may even cook, and that may be something not to your liking. Some neighbors may smoke, and the smoke may come into your unit. Some neighbors may place objects in the common areas, and that may not be to your liking either. So we're going to take you through some of these scenarios to give you an idea of some of the options that you may have when you come across such situations. Now, before we do that, Lei Teng, would you like to walk us through some of the organizations in Singapore that someone can approach to help manage some of these situations?
Sure, happy to. Of course, I think the first thing is that because you're dealing with neighbors, the first thing you should probably try to do is a little bit of self-help. But depending on whether you live in a housing development flat or private housing, condominium, or landed property, there are various organizations that you can go to. If you have a community that has a residents association, that will be helpful. In the HDB, you actually have the town council. In some areas, you have active residents committees. And actually, if you really need a lot more help, you can go to the Community Mediation Center, which is established by the Ministry of Law. And at the very, very last resort, if you have to, you can go to court, which is the Community Dispute Resolution Tribunal.
Thank you for that introduction. Sunil, can you share with us a little bit more about the Community Mediation Center?
Thank you, Philip. Community Mediation Center, as mentioned by Lei Teng, is under the auspices of Ministry of Law. It was set up about 25 years ago to try and help the community resolve disputes at a very low cost, whether be it social, relational, or any issues that arise amongst community members, amongst neighbors and all. Over the years, the mediators have resolved over thousands of cases, at a success rate of about 80% or more. And it has been quite a good initiative where it offers a lot of parties or neighbors, community members, a very low cost option to try and resolve any issues that they might have. It's very convenient. And also a quick solution where the one who goes to Community Mediation Center has to have about 2 hours to try and resolve their matter. I mean, it can go beyond 2, but on average, we normally complete within 2 hours. And it's something that helps parties avoid going to court as well. So that, it gives them an option to try and resolve matters where they can rebuild the relationships with their neighbors or with their community members, and something that can help them build the bridge and move forward in their lives rather than having to go through the court option or anything else. So it's a very popular option. It's taken off quite well, and it's doing quite, a lot of cases go to CMC now.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful to kind of give us the background before we start our first case study. So let's start with the first case study. So these are all fictional scenarios that we have come up with, and it's more to kind of explain some of the options available to you when you encounter similar situations. So in our first case study, we have Mr. Tan and his family who are living in a corner HDB flat. So Mr. Tan's neighbor has placed a big shoe cabinet in the corridor and many other potted plants that narrow the path to Mr. Tan's flat. Now, the neighbors sometimes leave their shoes all over the corridor. The plants will also shed leaves, which go onto the floor and litter the corridor as well. Mr. Tan has an elderly father who lives with him, and he uses a walking stick. So the shoes, the dead leaves, and the narrow pathway can sometimes be a hazard for Mr. Tan, his family, and particularly his dad. So Sunil, what do you think the options are for the Tan family?
Sure. This I've seen in my capacity as a volunteer mediator with CMC. I've seen similar cases arise where, the items we leave outside our house causes inconvenience to neighbors or causes some form of issues, because a lot of us tend to think that the space outside our house is a natural extension of our residential premises. So we tend to try and take control of that space as well. And, being a grassroots leader as well, we often come across cases where neighbors are complaining about items left outside as causing a hindrance or an issue. In such situations and anyone facing that, I mean, the options are first is to try and communicate with your neighbor, because very often a lot of things can be a misunderstanding, or it can be easily resolved by simply speaking to your neighbor, and your neighbor might, understand or empathize with your situation. And, when you mentioned the person as a old folk who has problems walking past the space and all, usually neighbors will empathize and try and clear the area and, try and keep it neat and tidy so that it doesn't cause a hindrance to others. Generally, a lot of people do that. In the event you can't communicate or there's any issue in the communication with the neighbor, one option is to always consult your grassroots leaders or residents committee or neighborhood committee in private properties, where these are volunteers who can try and help, neighbors try and bond or try and overcome such issues. Sometimes parties might consider going to their MP or member of parliament for help. And normally, if you go up to such authority, usually if the MP steps in, or grassroots or senior grassroots leader or senior member of the community comes in, normally they will also try and mediate and resolve the matter for parties' understanding. Some occasionally there are parties who will also consider going to HDB or town council to ask for help on them, because this space outside the house is common space shared by all, and town council or might get involved and give a notice or inform them to try and clear the area and remove all the heavy items that are blocking the path, or to try and keep it neat and tidy. By that stage, normally things can get resolved as well. In the event that doesn't get resolved by the town council, or if you want to consider an alternative, you might want to consider writing in or calling community mediation center to try and arrange a mediation with your neighbor, to see. And community mediation center will then organize a mediation session where you can come with your neighbor, and you can try and resolve the matter before the presence of a mediator who will be acting as a neutral party to try and help parties reach a resolution there.
Thank you, Sunil. So Lei Teng, what about if the Tan family wants to bring this to the courts? Can you explain how someone can do that through the process of the court system?
So the Community Dispute Resolution Act was established because there were situations where neighbor disputes really got to a stage where there was a lot of disharmony. So the CDRT, which is the Community Dispute Resolution Tribunals, is actually set up for people to bring claims against their neighbors with respect to neighbor disputes. Lawyers are not allowed. So in many ways, what this does is that it actually requires you to put in a claim. And these days, because our courts have everything done online, you can actually apply for a CJTS account, and then you fill in the claim form. And then when the claim form is filled in, then a notice would be sent to your neighbor, and then your neighbor and you would have to appear in court. And actually what actually happens as well is that the judicial officer will also try to mediate. But of course, mediation with the judicial officer is slightly different when it's compared to mediation by a community mediator. So I think the most important thing, though, about the Community Dispute Resolution Tribunals really is that it's intended to be, I guess, a last resort. And even as a last resort, actually, the courts try to get people to talk to each other, to try and understand each other's views. But of course, they also have the power to issue orders of court that require compliance. And actually, there is a stage of staging of enforcement measures, so that ultimately, the very ultimate issue that you can actually get is that you could actually be deprived of your residential rights if you are so unreasonable as to completely ignore, enforcement measures.
Thank you. So hopefully that gives a brief summary of some of the options available to the Tan family. Now let's move on to our second case study, where we can maybe delve into some of these processes in a bit more detail. So in our second case study, we have Ms. Go, who resides in an HDB flat. So Ms. Go smokes regularly on her balcony. Mr. Ahmed lives next door and doesn't like the smoke fumes that are blown into his flat by the wind. Now, Mr. Ahmed has spoken to Ms. Go about this situation on a few occasions, But Ms. Go believes that she has every right to smoke on her balcony. So Lei Teng, I've got a couple of questions here. Firstly, Mr. Ahmed feels he may have to consider mediation in this case. So they have spoken to Ms. Go a couple of times. So in your opinion, do you think that mediation would be a suitable option for Mr. Ahmed in this case?
Definitely.
Okay.
So what mediation does is that it gives you a third party neutral whose role and skill is to actually get parties to talk to each other, to understand each other, and to reach a mutual agreement, right? So as a third party neutral, a mediator is not a judge, a mediator is not an advisor. But as mediators, we have the training to get people to really express their views and to find a way of getting people to understand and appreciate where each other is coming from. So in a situation like this, where you're really talking about lifestyle, right? Because you're talking about somebody who likes to smoke, and, you know, some of these people will say it's my home and I'm smoking in my balcony and it's my home. So why don't I have the right to do that? On the other hand, you also have the neighbor who has the right to have open windows in the balcony and the right not to smell cigarette smoke. So it's a lifestyle choice, and we can't really impose it on each other. So mediation is actually a very good way for people to actually talk to each other, appreciate where each other is coming from. And in my experience, and I'm very sure in Sunil's experience as well, mediation can actually give rise to very creative solutions, right? And that's one of the best things about mediation.
Right. And I see a couple of questions, and I have the same questions as one of our participants. So the question is, well, how do I start this mediation process, right, at the CMC? Do I need to inform my neighbor? So in this case, how does Mr. Ahmed go about beginning this process, and how can they persuade Ms. Go to go through the mediation?
Sure. Mr. Ahmed can write in or call or attend CMC's office to ask for a mediation session to be registered. And CMC will then go about organizing the mediation session with the neighbor. You know, it's a very low cost option where he just has to pay about $5 to register the case. And once the case has been registered, CMC will reach out to the neighbor and organize a session when both parties are available. It could be during a weekday morning or afternoon, or even a weekend on Saturday mornings, to come to CMC's office, or they could consider doing a Zoom mediation or attend one of satellite centers that have been set up for satellite mediation, which means at different venues there are mediation offices set up for them to have a mediation at a place that's convenient to them. Once they do that, they can attend the mediation session. And like Lei Teng shared, a lot of these cases I've observed, they tend to get resolved when parties speak to each other during the mediation session. Because on one hand, and I can just share a bit of experience, on one hand, some parties feel that, you know, this is my home, this is my place, I can do whatever I want. But when they come for the mediation session and they listen to the other party and how the actions are affecting the other party or causing any health issue or affecting the health status of a elderly person or young children there, they tend to understand, empathize, and, you know, agree to some solution where they can, you know, maybe smoke during certain hours or in certain places, and then, you know, the other party doesn't get so affected. I can share there was one case where I mediated where the neighbor above was complaining about the neighbor below smoking. The smoke was coming up to his unit and all. And during the mediation session, when they heard how the smoke is affecting the children's health and all that, the neighbor above actually said that he was going to quit smoking anyway, and decided to, you know, use that as an impetus to quit smoking. And because he didn't want his actions to be affecting young children or anyone above. And the neighbor above was, you know, felt very good, happy about it. And even they said that, you know, we'll send you apples to your place whenever you want to smoke. So that form of a bit of a dispute became an opportunity for them to build neighborliness and become good neighbors, actually. One party decided to quit smoking, the other party decided to send apples as a form, you know. So that kind of solution can be arrived at when you come for mediation. And very often, not just for smoking, but for noise or any other issue that they might be having, when they come for mediation and they get a chance to air their side of the story, and then the mediator allows each party to enough time to speak. And when they have shared what their side of the stories and they heard the other party, they tend to feel or empathize, when they speak as elderly person or young children or how their actions is affecting someone. They speak and they start to communicate and come to a certain solution, that can help both parties move on in their lives.
I think that's really helpful. And I think that also answers one of the questions that I saw just now about, well, when you speak to your neighbor about a conflict, sometimes it escalates and gets worse. But I think, Sunil, you've demonstrated some examples of how actually the relationship can get better, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I have some specific questions here. What is the cost of the mediation? And also, can Mr. Ahmad choose the mediator that kind of discusses your case with you?
For Community Mediation Center, the cost for the applicant to register the case is about $5. And after that, the case can go through. They can't choose the mediator because, if each party starts choosing the mediator, then that's not going to help. Like later mentioned, the mediator is a neutral third party and is usually assigned or appointed by CMC, Community Mediation Center, to basically oversee the case and oversee the session, hear both sides, and try and reach a resolution. The mediator will be is not a judge. Is not there to judge or come to a decision or make decisions for parties. The mediator is there to basically be a neutral third party to listen to both sides in an objective manner and try and help parties come up with options and reach resolution among themselves. So the mediator cannot be appointed by any party. It's put forth by CMC, Community Mediation Center, and you'll be a party that's not affiliated with either applicant or respondent. In the event the mediation concludes with a binding agreement or anything, and later on there's any issue with the binding agreement, parties can come back to CMC for a remediation or a second session at no cost.
I just want to add that I had the privilege actually of sitting in the same office as CMC officers. So they're not the mediators, they're the staff that entertain CMC applications. And in answer to one of the questions, what happens if the respondent doesn't want to show up for the mediation, or do I have to tell them? I can tell you I have overheard many very persuasive conversations from the CMC staff that actually explain what mediation is about and explain that it is actually a very good opportunity for them to sit down and have a civilized discussion with somebody. So I think some of the questions were, but what if I approach that person, because you're saying self-help first, and what if that approach gives rise to conflict, right? So these are things we really have to be very aware of. And I would actually say, be sensible about it, right? So don't approach when you're upset, right? Don't approach when they are upset. And if from your observations and your sense, maybe it's not so easy to approach your neighbor at the start, then maybe just go straight to CMC first and let the lovely officers of the CMC actually get both of you speaking. And the other thing is that you really don't want to choose your mediator because, think about it this way, right? It is in the interest of the CMC for your case to settle, right? So they will pick the best mediator for you, the one that best suits the language requirements for both sides, the one that best suits, like, sort of, do you need someone who's young and hip, or do you need someone who's a little bit older and gray hair? So that sort of thing, the CMC is actually set up for that, because they would look at the situation, they will find the best possible mediator to fit that particular dispute.
And just to add to Lei Ting, CMC has a panel of mediators from all walks of life, all age groups, not young, but, with sufficient experience, quite a number with sufficient gray hair, with seniority, who are there, with some life experience can listen and try and help parties. And just to add that sometimes people are afraid to speak, to their neighbor and all that. But when I have parties who are coming from far corners of Singapore and they come for mediation at the CMC Center, and the first question I ask them is, have you all spoken to each other before? And these are neighbors either staying side by side or one above the other. And the answer is quite often no, they have not spoken to each other. And this is the first time they are meeting each other, or they have only seen each other in the lift and said hi. And when they are there and they see each other and they talk and they listen to each other, then they start to realize, how much they have in common, and how they can understand each other's sentiments and issues. And very often cases get settled quite quickly. And that's why I said they are settled within 2 hours, and settlement rate is quite high.
So thank you for that. I mean, it seems like you've answered a lot of the questions, because I think there's a lot of concern from some of our participants about, well, I don't know my neighbor. What if he or she refuses to speak to me? I think you've answered that. And it's addressing kind of general common sense. It's about trying to be cordial to the extent that you can. It's about trying to explain your position and kind of finding some common ground with your neighbor. So I have another question. So let's say Mr. Ahmed and can persuade his neighbor to go to mediation. What should he do to then prepare for the mediation? And should he instruct a lawyer to attend with him?
Okay, I'll take that question. Lawyers are not allowed at the CDRT for good reason, because as lawyers, we're advocates, right? And so we would find ways to win the case. But having said that, there are scenarios where lawyers are very helpful in a mediation. But really, because in CMC mediations, you're really talking about community disputes, right? So it's very important for the individual to speak for himself or herself. How do you go about preparing for a mediation? Well, think about it in terms of what is it that is bothering you? Why is it bothering you? And what would you like the mediator to know, so that you feel heard, and also so that there's some possibility for resolution, right? So don't think about going for a mediation as, oh, my bottom line is this, right? Because then you're not giving anybody any chance. Go with an open mind, but also go knowing where you would like things to be able to actually change, right? And in some ways, actually preparing for mediation, sometimes it's helpful to speak to someone who may know the law, to know the limits of what can or cannot happen. But oftentimes it's really about thinking about how you want to approach the problem in a civil, constructive way. So don't think about going for the mediation as these are the 15 points I want to say about my nasty neighbor, right? But also don't think about it in terms of, I will give you this if you give me that, because you are holding back the mediator's ability to create or help you create a solution. Think about what your needs are. Maybe try and think about what their needs may be, the neighbor, and then go for the mediation with an open mind, because any good mediator will guide you through the process, and you don't have to worry, because it really is about addressing your needs.
Thank you.
And to add to Lei Ting, during the mediation process, the mediator will listen to both sides, to share their side of the story. And if required, the mediator will have a one-to-one session with each party. We call it the private caucus, where they will explore the issues in greater detail and see what options can be generated by parties that can help resolve the matter. So that when both parties come together again, they can explore the options that have been generated by both parties to see what resolution can be reached. So in a way, to prepare for mediation, like Lei Ting mentioned, don't just come with all the 15 things to say nasty about your neighbor, but go there with a mindset that you want to reach a resolution so that you can move forward in your life. You can leave the nasty baggage behind, let the water be under the bridge, and you can move forward. And how do you move forward? By coming up with certain solutions or certain options that the other party can accept, and both parties can move forward happily together.
And are all the mediators, are they lawyers or are they non-lawyers?
No, they are not all lawyers. I mean, mediators, they come from all backgrounds. Many of them are from, some of them lawyers, some of them accountants, some of them managers, some of them, engineers,
teachers,
HR, teachers, retirees, from all walks of life.
Okay, thank you. So once we've got a settlement from the mediation, is the settlement then binding on both parties?
Let me take that, Lei Ting. When parties have reached a settlement, they could, the mediator will record what has been agreed in an agreement. It will be read to both parties agree with it, they will sign. Then it becomes a legally binding contract between parties. That shows that it has the force of law, because both parties are signing it willingly and they are agreeing to the terms therein. Now, after this mediation, if there's any breach of that contract or agreement, parties, like I mentioned earlier, parties can seek remediation to come back and see if they can iron out the kinks in the contract, or if anything needs to be addressed or anything needs to be improved upon, so that at remediation or the second mediation session, which is at no cost, parties can try and see how they can improve on the contract and how they can improve on the matters that are between them so that they can move forward.
If I can just add, right, one of the things about mediation and the reason why it's so popular really in the resolution of all sorts of disputes, not just community disputes, is that a mediation that is well done will not be one that is about enforcement. It's actually more about compliance. Because if you think about it, if it was a deal that you reached between two people who are living next to each other, right, or living in close proximity, and you have agreed to certain things, most of the time, when people have said, I agree, I will do this, they will abide by it.
That's correct.
And if they can't, they will talk about it. Because again, a well-run mediation will actually mean that there's some way of communicating, right? Now, actually, at this point, I want to say also that, we are also very realistic. I mean, we are lawyers, so we have seen situations where mediations didn't give rise to a resolution or gave rise to a resolution that maybe was breached. People couldn't comply with it. So that happens as well. But that's also why there are different degrees of escalation of the problem, right? I'm sure there are people who know from TikTok and YouTube and whatever about certain so-called nasty neighbors and how that problem hasn't been resolved. But what I can assure you is that from what I know of how neighbor disputes have actually been dealt with ever since the CDRA, the Act, came about, and the CDRT, the tribunals were established, as well as the Community Mediation Center, the vast majority of the cases actually are resolved well, right? And people can live with each other. They don't have to become best friends, but they know what the limits are of proper behavior. And when you have a situation where someone maybe doesn't necessarily comply, then you can go to the court, and then the court can actually have different levels of escalation as well.
Okay.
Totally agree. And sometimes it also happens that during mediation, parties get caught up in the heat of the moment because they are so much into what they wanted, or they didn't get it. They say they claim to know their rights. They know what their next step is. They can go to court, sue, this, that, everything. Then the mediator will take the time and trouble to, calm down the person and explore the alternatives that the party has, so that they realize, is it really worth going to court for this? Yeah. Is it really worth suing for this? Is it really worth undergoing further tension for this? Or can we reach some form of agreement where you live, I live, we can both live? I can't get everything I want, but we can reach some form of common ground where we can move forward. And mediators, especially at Community Mediation Center, we try and reach that common ground so that parties can find something that works for both of them.
Thanks. Thank you. That's really helpful. And I think that's answered one of the questions regarding the concern that when you go into the mediation, both parties are still at loggerheads with each other. Lei Teng, I just want to pick up on something you mentioned, because you talked about how we're lawyers, we're realistic. It doesn't always come to a resolution for both parties. So one of the questions that we have is, well, what if the mediator is pushing for something and both parties feel that the option that the mediator is giving is not to anyone's benefit?
Yep.
What should one do then?
Say so. Say so. So the thing about mediation is that it's actually not easy, right? And actually for many mediators, they become mediators because they feel that they are problem solvers. And what a lot of mediators forget is this is not your life. This is not your house, so this is not for you to say that this is the obvious solution. And because mediation is private, right? It's not like somebody's watching the mediator. So sometimes mediators can get carried away and think, oh my God, my solution is so brilliant. Why do you want to do it? So just remember that the whole point of mediation is that it is voluntary. Voluntary in two ways. Number one, you attend the mediation voluntarily, right? So if you're the claimant and you're the one that brings up the case, then of course you attend. If you're the respondent and you want to attend, then it's voluntary, right? And of course, if the respondent doesn't attend, and if you cannot be persuaded by CMC, then of course go to CDRT. Right. The other way in which mediation is voluntary is it is up to you whether you want to sign the agreement or not. Right. And if you don't think that the agreement is something that you can live with, just say so.
That's right.
Right? And if you feel that the mediator is a little bit overzealous, Sunil has referred to the private sessions. There's nothing wrong with calling for a private session and saying, Mr. Mediator, I cannot take this one. This one, I really cannot, right? Give the mediator a bit of face also, so that the mediator can have some way of thinking about some other resolution, right? And actually one other thing, I don't really know whether CMC does this, but this happens with the other mediation organizations that I work with. Sometimes it's about chemistry. Sometimes that particular mediator maybe doesn't have the right chemistry for the two of you. So sometimes if it doesn't necessarily work, please don't give up on mediation, because you can actually, I think, call up CMC and say, actually, the two sides actually want to settle. Can you find us another mediator? Because this one maybe doesn't quite gel with us enough, right? Because really, at the end of the day, the CMC wants things to be settled. They want people to actually live together harmoniously to the extent that you can.
Thank you.
Possible. And just to add, the whole mediation session is confidential. Whatever we discuss with parties is kept confidential within the four walls. And anything that we discuss during the private session one-to-one with each party is also kept confidential with that party. And the mediator only discloses what that party allows us to disclose to the other side. So it's a very confidential process. And, people can speak freely during the joint session or during the one-to-one sessions as well.
Thank you. Now, have you ever experienced any cases where a family has gone to the mediation? So maybe one of the siblings is upset with a family member in that family, and they have an issue that they can't resolve themselves. What have you seen in that respect?
One of my early cases, which I was involved in, was where, two brothers, they had to look after their younger sister who was disabled or, not very well. And the two brothers were squabbling over who should look after that sister. One brother was, the elder one used to look after, then the younger one, he one day just basically put the sister in front of the house of the elder one. So the elder one, when he opened the door, the sister was outside. And, and there was no agreement among them. So they came for mediation to try and see what resolution they can reach. This was one of the early cases I looked at. And there, we had to discuss with parties, and tell them that this is your sister that we are talking about. And this is your own family member, and sometimes we have to appeal to the emotions and let parties understand, because sometimes they get so blinded by their own side or own sense of the story or what other people are feeding them that they are unable to see the other side. And as mediators, we tend to, be able to share with them how things are appearing and what can be done, from our own experience, but let parties decide what they want to do. And when parties realize that, okay, yeah, this is their own flesh and blood sister of, some family member, they realize that it's not just facts or, hard feelings, but emotions as well, and looking after someone. So there they tend to try and find a way to come to some form of agreement. In that case, they came to arrangement. Now, what happened after that, I do not know whether they lived up to the arrangement, but I really hope that sister was well taken care of.
But strictly speaking, CMC doesn't handle family mediations, right?
Not the divorce type or anything. It's more like, certain relationship kinds, but not the family law or divorce kind of situations.
Yeah, but there are many other organizations that offer mediation services.
Yes.
So actually, if you just Google mediation, you will see the Singapore Mediation Center is there. The Law Society actually has mediation services, and there are individual private organizations that also offer mediation services. So when it comes to family disputes and family issues, there are places that you can go to, that you can Google. And if you don't know, actually Pro Bono SG, I'm very sure, would actually be able to refer you to the right organization or the right mediator. And of course, some mediators charge less, some are free, some charge more. It all depends. But actually, on the broader scale, moving away from neighbor disputes, actually mediation is available for almost anything.
Yeah, you're right. And now mediation has become a very popular option as an alternative dispute resolution, that from community disputes to family matters to consumer disputes to civil cases or, high value contractual claims, mediation is available across the spectrum for all of it. Right. And in Singapore, what I like, the beauty of it is that you've got this very low cost option to try and resolve community matters, between neighbors or, between community members and all. Option is there to try and resolve the matter and not allow it to escalate or become bad blood or, something that you have to go to court for it. I mean, the option is there for you to try. It's the first step of dispute resolution.
Thank you. Another question on the mediation process. Now, let's say I'm living by myself and there's a family next door that has a conflict with me, and they're a family of 5 people, and I'm very intimidated by this. So how does the mediation process kind of get the parties comfortable that they're on an equal footing?
Yeah. You want to take that?
I mean, when they come for mediation, we do explain the process. We tell them, first we look at how many members on the other side. We don't allow too many people in the room. The key decision makers are there, the people who can speak. We let them speak, and the mediator is there to try and keep it as an even ground, to facilitate the process. So we are in a way like a facilitator to try and help parties, speak on equal footing and not be intimidated or anything. Yeah. If necessary, we can have a one-to-one session with each party to try and explain in greater detail, and basically manage the process. So in a way, mediators are there as facilitators and also to manage the process. Lei Teng, do you have anything?
I think it would be in very rare situations where any first mediation would actually have a game of numbers. So I think a well-run mediation would be one where it would sort of start off with maybe we have 1 or 2 spokespersons.
Yeah.
And then, and then maybe 2 people on one side and one person on the other. And the mediator is very heightened to the idea of the need for equality. But I would actually say also that because we're talking about neighbor disputes and people meet each other all the time, in order for there to be a complete resolution, I would say that generally it should reach the point where there can be a conversation with everyone if it is necessary. But I think that one of the main things that I can sort of emphasize to you is that any mediation organization worth their salt, and all the mediation organizations in Singapore reach that standard, would always be very concerned about the need for fairness at the start of the mediation and keep establishing and re-establishing that fairness and neutrality. So if you feel that you're going for a mediation and you feel like you are in a position of like less strength, so let's say, for example, you feel that you're a more timid person and you can't speak up, and then your neighbor tends to shout, right? Please say that to the CMC so that they can adjust accordingly, or they can let the mediator know so that the mediator is able to sort of, manage the situation instead of giving the mediator a big nasty surprise. But then, of course, we have mediated before, and then at the start, everybody looks great. And then after a while, there's shouting that happens. But mediators are very experienced in managing people. So in that sense, our main job as mediators is to maintain neutrality, giving everybody a safe space. Sometimes when people are a little bit too emotional, that might also be a situation where we will say, okay, let's have a break. Let's split out and let's speak individually until we're ready again.
And some parties, they do come with a companion who they can, for emotional support or just to be able to speak on their behalf. So some parties do come with a companion or a family member that can help them in the conversations. And also one thing to add is that the mediator at the very start will set the ground rules that nobody is to use any disrespectful language or abusive language. All that is left outside the door. We be very cordial and behave like real ladies and gentlemen, try and keep a neutral tone and be able to converse in a very amicable manner. So, the mediator will often set the ground rules and in order to manage the process. And that helps parties also to feel at ease when they're speaking to each other.
Thank you, Sunil. So let's move away from the HDB setting and let's see how we can resolve a neighbor conflict in a condominium setting. So we have Mr. Raj, who resides on the 4th floor of a 6-story condominium, and he's noticed that water has been dripping from his ceiling. There's also some water damage, and it looks like there's some mold that's been formed due to the water leaking into his flat. So, Lei Teng, what would you advise Mr. Raj to do in this situation?
Well, condominiums are subject to the Building Maintenance and Strata Management Act. Then you also have the MCST that can come in. But basically under the Act, the presumption is that the upper floor is liable for any leak and for any repairs. So generally, actually, there would actually have to be that kind of obligation. If necessary, there can actually be a joint inspection to determine where the leak comes from. And then, of course, then there would, as a result of the joint inspection, then you would actually have some idea of who should be responsible for repairing the leak. But so condominiums, because you have an MCST, you can actually approach the MCST, and hopefully the MCST has some people or has access to people who can help you to actually mediate the dispute. And of course, if things are not settled, there is the Strata Titles Board, which also offers evaluation of the situation and offers a mechanism for you to resolve the problem.
Thank you. Sunil, does that apply in an HDB setting?
In a HDB setting, if anybody has that kind of issues where there's leakage through the coming through the ceiling because of the floor above, they can always approach HDB for assistance, and HDB will try and identify the source of the issue, why the water is leaking and what is happening. And as if I'm not mistaken, both parties will bear the cost on a equal basis, split 50-50. It's not like one party has to bear, not the other, but both parties will split the cost if an issue has been identified. There are times where, if a grassroots advisor has referred the matter to HDB, or HDB has some form of a scheme where HDB will pay 50% of the cost and the other 50 will be split between the neighbors, the one above and the one below, in order to try and see if something can happen there. In the event you are staying on the top floor and there's water leakage on your ceiling, then the space above is like common ground. It will be under town council's maintenance, and town council can be contacted to try and see why there's leakage through the roof, and town council will try and rectify the kind of issue.
Okay, thank you. Before we go into some of the questions that I'm seeing here, let's move on to our last scenario first. So the De Silva family has been hearing noises, kind of they sound like marbles which are dropping onto the floor. Now the family's convinced that their neighbor living above them is the one who's causing the noise. However, that neighbor has been approached and denies making any such noises. So in this case, it's very difficult to actually determine what the source of the noise is. So Lei Teng, what would you do? What can the De Silva family do in this case? Because they're at a loss as to who is doing this and what to do.
So the trouble with noise situations that arise in high rise, and we're not just talking about HDB, right, is that it's often very hard to pinpoint. And then you are convinced that actually it's the upstairs neighbor. But honestly, if you are the upstairs neighbor, you'll be sort of wondering why people are complaining when you're not doing anything. And in fact, this problem is prevalent enough that there are agencies out there that help you to detect where the noise comes from. There are agencies out there that help you to record the severity of the noise and so on. So I think that the first thing is actually don't assume. Don't assume that the upstairs neighbor is playing with marbles, because who does, right?
Especially in the middle of the night.
Exactly. And don't assume that people are deliberately dragging chairs and furniture around, because again, who would want to do that in the middle of the night? So the first thing is don't assume. The second thing is actually ask for help. And actually, one of the good things about living in HDB is that you have the town council. And actually, people who work in town council, kudos to you. You all have a lot of patience. But really, they are the people that you can ask for help, and maybe they can help you to investigate the source of the noise. In some instances also maybe to sort of ascertain whether the level of noise really is so bad, because I think some of us can be a little bit more sensitive than others. Not to say that you have to live with it, but it's really about that level of self-awareness as well. So noise issues, I have to say, are not so easy to detect, not so easy to resolve. Because it really has to do with the building structure and engineering and that sort of thing, right? But when you do identify the source of the noise, and then the solution would come.
And just to add, I mean, they contact HDB as well because it's within the unit. of a HDB dwelling.
Mm.
So HDB will try and see where the noise is coming from and also provide assistance in that regard. Very often, noise disputes do come to CMC. In fact, it's one of the top referred cases or one of the most frequently heard cases at CMC, noise dispute, where the neighbor above, like Leighton shared, the complaint is that the neighbor above is causing the noise. And the noises are like marble dropping or pounding in the middle of the night, dragging of furniture, or people running, stomping above. And those that are, you can easily identify because the neighbor above says, yeah, my children are running and all that. Okay, there we can try and see what solution can be reached. But there are sometimes that the neighbor above totally denies and says that he himself or she herself are hearing similar noises coming from elsewhere. But it's just that the neighbor above is less sensitive, the neighbor below is more sensitive. And is more affected by the noise. And there are times where I had cases where they say the noise is coming from the room above, but there's nobody staying in the room above. It's just that the noise could be from elsewhere, but it travels.
Yeah.
Noise travels and all that. So in the kind of situation like Leighton suggested, you could approach agencies to try and determine where the noise is coming from. Or if they come to CMC, and in such situations, often I have to ask them, they need to communicate with each other. If the noise is from the respondent's place, then respondent will say that he will take steps to try and minimize the noise or try to remove the source of the noise. But if the respondent says, no, this is not from them, then both will cooperate with each other or work together to try and identify the source of the noise, because both are also being affected. But that gives us an opportunity for for neighbors to communicate. And we put that down on paper that, neighbors will communicate and try and, identify the source of the noise. And in a way, it becomes a situation where parties start to cooperate and become better neighbors actually after that.
Thank you, Sunil. So, I mean, I think many of us here have been in similar situations where we have heard noises, but we can't identify where it's coming from. So this is really useful advice, which brings me to a follow-up question. So, okay, so I've heard the noise, and I want to take this further. So what are some useful forms of evidence in the CDRT for noisy neighbors upstairs? I mean, I think one of our participants finds that the sound recordings may be difficult to prove in court or to bring to court, and there's no video showing any of these things because of its noise. So what would your advice be here in kind of coming up with some evidence that can be presented in a tribunal?
Well, so one of the things that we were doing when I was running this pro bono program for the CDRT is actually we were helping people to put the evidence together. And as far as noise is concerned, actually there are people you can go to who can help you to detect the noise. And then there is, it's actually not your mobile phone, it's actually quite sophisticated devices that help to detect the noise, but how many of us can afford that, right? I've also had situations where I have had helped applicants who actually have been able to record the noise. And what you do when you record the noise is that you actually burn it into a CD, and then you actually identify on a piece of paper what the noise is and where, so that the judge can actually see and hear what the noise is. So putting the evidence together is somewhat laborious, but there are people you can go to for assistance. But actually, the first thing I would say is don't jump to conclusions, right? Because I've also helped people who have actually told me, I am convinced my neighbor every night is banging on the bucket. And I'm thinking, why would anybody do that, right? And this person was just swearing blind this is happening because the old lady upstairs, she would just take a bucket and she go dang, dang, dang. I'm like, how do you know? Have you actually seen it happen, right? And they'd go, no, but it's the sound I hear. It has to be that. So I would say that, when we're living in close proximity, of course, noises bother us. If something comes up, right, try and find some avenue, town council, HDB, whatever, to help you to investigate the noise first before you accuse anybody of anything, right? Because that just starts everything off on the wrong foot.
Correct.
Right? And then when sufficient investigations have been carried out and you can be reasonably sure about who is causing the noise, then actually the town council might be able to help you to approach that person. And then if really they've tried to approach and they have established that actually there is the source of the noise because it's regular or whatever, then you put the evidence together and then you put an application to the CDRT. To my knowledge, though, I think the CDRT doesn't manage. I mean, I haven't actually seen these noise cases being dealt with. It's actually more the intercultural issues. So some of the questions I'm seeing have to do with like prayers and smoking and that sort of thing, right? So while the CMC does try to do things to settle matters, I've also experienced that when you actually have a mediation that's conducted by a judge in the Community Dispute Resolution Tribunal, it's a different layer of mediation because it's done by a judge within the court. And it can be very effective, right? And it can be especially effective when we're talking about sort of cross-cultural issues as well. Not to say CMC can't do it, they can. But like I said, it's about escalation. Okay, so always think about things in measured terms. So people are asking things like, shall I make a police report, right? Or, you know, shall I complain to the town council? Isn't this illegal? Isn't this an offense, right? I think that's sort of starting off at too high a level, right? Unfortunately, I've had to deal with a few criminal matters where instead of going to all these different avenues, there are people who make police reports against each other and that sort of thing. And it just sort of sours things. It's not that you can't make a police report or a magistrate complaint, but think about those as escalation rather than the first port of call.
Correct.
Yeah.
I often suggest, the parties not to call the police immediately, because the police has other priorities as well. So unless it's a threat to life and property, don't involve the police immediately, because you are, like you said, you're starting off on the wrong footing by, having police visiting your house and making reports and all that. Or issues such as noise or, items left outside or things like that. That is not something that it requires you to immediately go to the police and get a report done. I mean, police has other things to do as well. So I often suggest to parties, don't get the police involved immediately for these kind of things.
That's right.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I think that's answered a couple of general questions that I've seen here without going into the specific fact pattern. Now, we thank you, Sunil. Thank you, Leiteng. So I believe that we have some time for Q&A. So I'm going to look at some questions which haven't yet been answered. So I've got a technical question here. What is the difference between CDRT and a magistrate complaint?
Okay. So CDRT is for disputes that fall within the Community Disputes Resolution Act. So it would have to be an issue in relation to your neighbor. It would have to be an issue that sort of affects your enjoyment of your property. Magistrate's complaint is for a wider, broader range of issues. And a magistrate's complaint actually is actually a private prosecution, right? Which gives rise to sort of quasi-criminal outcomes, right? So an order of court, a fine, that sort of thing. So the difference between the two actually is that they both actually do refer you to mediation first and then failing that to trial. But the resolution that you can get from a magistrate's complaint is very different from the kind of creative resolutions that you can possibly get under the CDRA, under the Community Disputes Resolution Tribunal. So, for example, under the Community Disputes Resolution Tribunal, you can actually have an order of court that requires compliance, and that can actually escalate to compliance where somebody has to execute a financial bond. So they have to, for example, if you're the house owner, you have to make sure that other people in the house don't cause this problem. And then if it is breached, then of course you lose the monetary bond. And of course, the very ultimate outcome for the CDRT is that you lose your property rights, which I believe has happened in at least one case. Whereas in a magistrate's complaint, it never gets to that extent, right? So I would say use the right forum for the right kind of dispute. And again, if you're in doubt, there are many legal clinics around where you can actually ask this question. Pro Bono SG also runs a lot of legal clinics, and you can ask these questions so that you know the right place to go.
Okay. So I have a good question here, which is a follow-up on our discussion about the mediation process.
Sure.
So we've got to a settlement agreement, and we're finding that one party has breached that settlement agreement. Can you then sue the other party because of a breach of a settlement agreement?
I mean, breach of a settlement agreement is like breach of a contract. So they can always go and ask for advice from lawyers or try and claim on a breach of contract. But here, when we are talking about community mediation and all that, we will encourage them to come back for remediation, which can be done within 3 months, and give the mediators, either the same one or maybe another one, an opportunity to iron out any issues that have arisen or improve on that particular agreement that was reached before, so that they can enter a new agreement. Is it an opportunity to try and resolve the matter before it escalates to, suing or claiming on a breach of contract and all?
But I would say that the breach of a settlement agreement arising from CMC in a neighbor dispute is probably one of the best things that you can use as the starting point for a CDRT application.
Yeah.
Yeah, because then it shows that you've tried. It shows that you've attempted the mediation, and then you put in all that evidence, and then you show that the person agreed but failed to do it, and then the court can then take over.
Right. So we have a practical issue here. So one neighbor is dealing with another neighbor who is a foreigner and is not accustomed to some of maybe the local rules or regulations. In that case, what would your advice be in communicating with that neighbor in connection with a dispute?
Okay, so I can say I've had similar issues before. Sometimes you have to think for yourself, are you the right person to approach? Because you are actually the one who's suffering, right? And actually it takes a lot for someone to be able to be the victim and also be the one that tries to educate the other side about what is right and what is wrong. So in situations like that, I think that having other neighbors around is very helpful.
Yeah.
Because if you look around for other neighbors who may actually be better at approaching the situation, they would actually be very good. So in my mother's house, there's a very active residence committee, right? And there's a WhatsApp and all that, right? So you kind of know from there who the sage, the nice old person who can talk to everybody is, right? Or who is the person who is maybe of a similar background in terms of where they come from, who understands how things happen in Singapore, who then might be the one who can approach the person. So, I think one of the most difficult things about neighbor disputes is that, our property is so precious to us. Our homes are so precious to us that when our enjoyment of our home is affected, we sort of immediately want to, right? But what you don't realize is that you're kind of stuck there for quite long, right?
Not easy to sell and buy.
Exactly, right? And then, of course you think, why am I the one who should sell? What is this, So be very, very measured about what you want to do when you have a neighbor dispute. So if you identify, actually the good thing is you're already identifying it as a cultural issue, then find the right people to help you to approach the cultural problem. Because I would actually say that you are probably the last person who should be educating your neighbor.
And to add, putting on my hat as a grassroots volunteer as well, grassroots leaders and our residence committee or neighborhood committees are not there just to do block parties or community bonding events. That's a major thing that they do as well. But one other thing is also to try and help neighbors get along. So in such situations where there are cross-cultural issues, or bringing in someone, like you mentioned, someone sage or someone senior from the residence committee to try and listen to parties and explain, people tend to respect that third party and listen to him because they know that third party is not there for any of their interests. He's not there for any agenda of his own. He's just there to try and help parties. And usually people appreciate that and listen, and they also realize, okay, this is something to learn. This is how things are done here or that way. And they become more amicable after that.
Yeah, I think these are really important messages for the participants on this webinar. And we realize that we can all find some of the things that our neighbors do to be difficult or things that annoy us. But I'm sensing that the common theme here is about using some of these things as a last resort. Trying to find that common ground with your neighbor first is always the best thing to do. Now, so I've got a couple of questions where things have escalated.
Okay.
And there's a state court order prohibiting one party from doing something.
Mhm.
Now he's now breached that court order.
Mhm.
So what can we do if the neighbor has breached the court order?
Go back to the court, right?
Okay.
And inform the court that the individual has breached a court order, and then allow the court process to take place. Yeah,
Thank you.
And breach of court order is not a small thing. It's quite a serious thing, actually.
that's right.
You know, is it considered contempt? No. Or...
It would be contempt depending on the nature of the court order.
Alright.
But if it's a CDRA court order, then there would be escalating measures as
Yeah.
well. So, okay, so I've come across situations where people say, look, I've done everything already. I've gone to the town council. I've been doing this for years.
Yeah.
It's really a problem, right? I do acknowledge that happens, but I would actually say that from what I have seen of the CDRT and the wonderful judges that they choose to actually man the CDRT, they are probably the ones that are best equipped to handle the situation.
Okay. So an interesting question, not necessarily a neighbor dispute. Now we have a healthcare worker. Can a healthcare worker who sees something happening in a flat with that person's patient's family? So I've gone to the family, and as a healthcare worker, I see that there's a dispute within the family which needs redress. Can I then go to the CMC to mediate this issue that I'm seeing?
I would say go to the Agency for Integrated Care. So because the Agency for Integrated Care is specially set up for family disputes, and also because we now have a Vulnerable Adults Act where there are measures that can be taken, right? And I'm very sure that if you go to the CMC, they'll tell you the same thing, right? So please don't think about it as CMC trying to tai chi it away. It's actually more finding the most appropriate place for these things to happen. So as a healthcare worker, if you observe things that you are concerned about, go to AIC and see whether anything can be done there.
Yeah, sometimes if someone needs guidance on who to go to, I mean, they can call up CMC hotline to find out.
Yeah.
But alternatively, they could always approach one of those legal clinics that are set up in each estate, you know, the pro bono legal clinics, either as part of the Meet the People session or standalone legal clinics, and to find out or get guidance on who to go to or where to go next, you know, and the answers are usually easily provided.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. This is a very specific question. I'm not sure if we have the answer here. So can I file a magistrate's complaint at only $20 instead of a CDRA claim, which might cost me more? And my neighbor would be then put to fear with criminal proceedings.
I am not aware that there is any cost or a prohibitive cost associated with the CDRT application. I'm just trying to remember whether it was $20 as well. I don't know, but I really don't recall. $150, sorry. Okay, so yes, a CDRT application is $150. So I guess if you want to save the money, you can file a magistrate's complaint, which apparently is less. But think about it this way, okay? This is your neighbor, all right? So are you going to do a neighbor dispute application? Are you going to say, I will prosecute you? Right? And I want you to pay me a fine, and I want you to go to jail, which hardly ever happens, right? So, I mean, if you are inclined to do that and burn bridges, think about the consequences lah.
And just to add, magistrate complaint also, the magistrate might refer it to CMC.
Correct.
So we get magistrate referrals as well, you know, where we have to try and resolve the matter there was a magistrate complaint involved.
So I think one of the things that I want to say about this as well is sometimes we also have to be self-aware.
Yeah.
Right. Sometimes we might be so highly strung that certain things we really cannot handle, right? Sometimes it could be a little bit of the things that we do. Sometimes also it's because you're so heightened, any small thing that the neighbor does irritates you. I'm not saying that there's no problem. I'm just saying that with mediation, with going to CMC, with talking to people, you can probably find the real reason for the real problem and then find a way of actually living together.
But I like that question because the person has done cost-benefit analysis. You know what's the cost. But like Lateng mentioned, think about the consequences after that. or the, what happens after that? Is this something that you are okay with and all that? You have to think beyond just filing the application for a certain amount of money.
Yeah.
You have to think beyond, what does this help, or what happens after that?
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think this is a very good question, this next one. So we've talked about some of the avenues that we can use. Now, in your experience, when you see a neighbor and they face each other after filing a claim at the CDRT, in your experience, how many of those cases then result in a worse off relationship between the neighbors because they've gone to the trouble of going to the CDRT? Do you see things getting worse or better in your experience? And also, we may have answered this question already, but do we need lawyers at the CDRT?
Well, lawyers are not allowed at the CDRT. I haven't really been pursuing the CDRT cases, so I can't say for sure. But I can say anecdotally, from what I have heard of a few cases, that in some situations, there's a healthy respect for the law, right? Because parties have had to come to court, parties have had to face a judge, and parties have had to actually answer to a judge, right? Which that's why I say it's actually quite different from the mediation by a CMC mediator. And parties have had a court order that is made against them. So where most people are law-abiding and civil and want to actually carry on with life, I would say generally that it has given rise to some kind of polite peace, right? Maybe not outright warring, because they know where they can go and they know what kind of solutions they can have.
Okay. Usually at CMC, when they reach a settlement at the end, I always encourage the parties, because CMC is at Maxwell Road. I always encourage them to go to the Maxwell food court and have breakfast together or lunch together, because you have already built the bridge, and encourage them to improve the relationship, through having a meal together or going back together. And often parties share the cab back home. So things start to improve. So that is at the CMC level.
Thank you. So we have a few questions which the questions are kind of the same, but the fact pattern is different. So I'm not going to necessarily read out all the questions in their totality, but the questions seem to be, well, I've got a conflict with my neighbor. The neighbor's being very aggressive. I'm a bit too scared to approach the neighbor. Sometimes I've spoken with the neighbor. Can I then sue them? Right. I think we've talked about this quite a lot already today, but maybe we kind of want to summarize. Well, I've just had enough of my neighbor. They're doing things which are very aggressive and offensive, and I'm scared of them. What could I do? Can I sue them?
I think that if they are aggressive, if they are doing acts that are causing you annoyance, it would actually be a POHA application, Protection from Harassment Act. Some of the cases that I've dealt with, you sort of are not sure whether it should be a POHA or whether it should be a CDRT. The difference between the two really is that for protection from harassment, there is the Protection from Harassment Court, but there's also the civil protection from harassment action, which you can take with a lawyer, where you can get protection orders. So if it is about harassment, meaning conduct and behavior that causes you harassment, alarm, or distress, then that would actually be a POHA application. POHA applications, like I said, you can actually do some of them through the community disputes resolution tribunals, in which case no lawyers are allowed, and then you can actually bring up your case, or you can do it as a civil claim, in which case you get civil remedies and then you get a lawyer to help you. But these kinds of cases are not cheap to do. It would not be easy to get a reasonably good lawyer to do this at a reasonable price. I would say that if you are afraid, and if it is actually causing you mental stress, then definitely go and find help. Go and get, actually, first of all, emotional support. So we have family service centers, we have counselors and social workers in these family service centers. They may not give you the legal resolution, but at least you don't feel alone. And that's very important. right? Once you've gotten that support, then the family service centers or the social workers can then actually support you as you go around, going to the legal clinics, for example, to find out whether there are any legal solutions that you can have. So I think one of the questions had to do with, the person feels suicidal because of the actions, right?
Yeah.
Please, your mental health is very important. Don't think about it in terms of, I will call the police, because, like Sunil says, the police are there to do much more important, pressing things. And they really can't hold your hand if your mental stress is such that you feel suicidal. The people who are qualified to help you with that would be the counselors and the social workers, to make you feel stronger, to make you feel that you're not alone. Then you take the steps, right? So those are the things to think
Definitely.
about.
And for that, those are like quite extreme or quite serious cases, until mental health issues are in concern.
Yeah.
Anything less than that or something not so bad yet or not so serious yet, they might want to consider going for, even meet the people session where see the MP or the volunteers there to get guidance on next steps, and see if they can try and help them in any way, give them guidance, refer them to the correct agencies, or even help refer the case to CMC, come for mediation with the other side, and try and see if you can resolve the matter in an amicable way.
Yeah.
So that's interesting, because there was a relevant question
Sure.
there. So prior to CDRA, Neighbours would approach the grassroots leaders or the MPs to mediate.
Yeah.
So this is a bit of a theoretical question, but would you agree that the CDRA has promoted a more litigious society?
I have not observed that yet. I have not seen that yet. I mean, I've seen more people thinking about their own rights and all that, but we are still a community where we try and, because we are so close together, we try and live together and get along with each other and find harmonious ways to work. Of course, there are some exceptions, there are some more serious cases and all that. And for that, you have the CDRT to help, resolve that matter, where people are quite antagonistic and they want to have their own way or the highway. That's when they go to CDRT, and like Lateng mentioned, you have a judge there listening to them and giving an order of court, and that has some force. That has an effect, because all of us at the end we will abide by the law, and that's the idea.
So I wouldn't say that the CDRA has made us more litigious, because the way it is run actually is not based on litigation.
Yeah.
I think it's a reaction really to our society developing to the point where conflicts arise a lot more. So it's really about finding a different avenue for those conflicts to be resolved.
Or conflicts that cannot be resolved at CMC or community mediation and need to be escalated.
Correct.
Because there are occasions when some parties are very strict about their rights or antagonistic or quite, they need more help, basically. And that can be given at the CDRT level.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Another question here is, so when would a person benefit from applying for a POHA application instead of going to CJTS?
Okay, so a POHA application, I think the first thing is that it potentially gives you an expedited protection order. Meaning that if you have sufficient grounds and sufficient evidence and you actually persuade a judge, you can actually have a temporary protection order, which lasts until the next hearing or until the matter is resolved. But those have to be quite severe. Right. But I have sort of helped out in cases where it really was quite severe behavior that really caused a lot of stress and tension. This was many years ago, but it was a little old lady, and her neighbor basically was constantly sort of destroying her Hindu shrine that was outside her room, her house, sorry, and actually would have people sort of sitting at the door of their house, basically facing her, and saying all sorts of things. So, that one was a little bit between like, is this a CDRT or is this a POHA, right? And I think in that case, we kind of recommended that she try for the POHA instead.
I see. Thank you. I've got a couple of questions about CCTV. This is a bit of a complicated question, which is maybe outside of the scope of this webinar, but can a neighbor install CCTV similar to the police equipment facing their flat or their house?
Okay, I think town council rules say no. Yeah, so you can't have a CCTV that is directed sort of outside of your premises. It can only be sort of shining on or focus on your own door.
Correct.
So in that sense, yes, you can't actually, have a CCTV that sort of records everybody. And in the same way with sort of landed property and all that, the general requirements of privacy are that you're not there to surveil everybody. The idea of the CCTV is your own security. So it should actually be your perimeter and your door. Yeah.
How would you then advise that neighbour if he feels that a neighbour is pointing the CCTV footage at his house?
I think first we need to determine why does the neighbor feel that way. Is there some evidence that he has that the CCTV is pointed towards him? What gave rise to that thought or belief? Then you can take it from there. I mean, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So then actually it's happened before. There's a celebrated case from many years ago.
Yeah.
They were doing shining flashlights, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And it was pre-CDRA days, right? And actually, unfortunately, that one became quite ugly until somebody moved. I would say that if you feel that that's happening to you, and if you are in HDB, that's the good thing about being HDB. Speak to the town council,
Yes,
speak
correct.
to your MP, or do something about it.
Yeah.
If you are in a condo, speak to the MCST because there are rules. If you are in private property, actually speak to your MP during the walkabout, right? Or go to the MPS, because I mean, this whole grassroots thing, as Sunil says, are people who are trying to sort of establish some peace in the community. And very often, if your neighbor is the sort that would actually direct their CCTV towards you, they are not likely to be people who will respond to you nicely. So then better to get a third party to come and approach them in a different kind of way. And by a third party, I don't mean complaint police, call police, whatever. Because again, like I said, if you actually go to grassroots or a residents association, they would have the presence of mind actually think about how to approach it instead of going and knocking on the door and say your neighbor complained you, right? Because then they're not doing their job.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we just have a few more questions left, which is good timing for today's webinar. I think we've kind of touched upon this topic in a bit of detail already. So there's a question about, well, the neighbor is doing something, they're smoking or they're throwing their cigarette butts at my door. Do I need to have some sort of evidence to bring to the mediation for this?
Yes, it's always helpful.
It's always helpful, correct. Usually they will have some photographs or something, but they need to identify where is it coming from. Someone throwing cigarette butt, is it directly unit above or where is it from? Quite often they will complain to NEA, National Environment Agency. And there are times when NEA has put up cameras to try and capture where people are throwing cigarette butts or, sometimes sanitary pads or something like that, or, babies' diapers. Where is it coming from and all that? Because then you can capture where is it coming from and be able to take action on it.
Okay. And then we had a question about our scenario 1. Should the town council enforce to clear up the corridor because it's a common area where all the plants were?
Yeah, that generally is the first port of call. So then town council will come and say, hey, so then in that way, it is a little bit of a shield lah, because then you can say that, oh, it wasn't me. The town council will come and observe and knock on the door and ask them to tidy up.
There are times when town council has seen bicycles obstructing the way and put up a notice that, the owner has to remove the bicycles.
Okay.
And have a clear passageway.
Yeah.
And then just on our smoking case, is it actually an offense to smoke in the balcony of an HDB flat?
That's a good question. I saw that and I was thinking, shall I Google it now? I don't know the answer, honestly. Yeah. I really don't know.
I do not know the answer as well. I mean, they are doing it within their own premises. They can do that. I mean, I think they can.
Yeah. Don't know. Sorry.
Okay. There's some questions coming in. I'm just going to have 1 or 2 more.
Sure.
And then it'll be time. So did you see a drastic rise of cases during COVID?
Oh, so I wasn't involved during COVID, so I wouldn't know.
I will say, there was an increase when people were all staying at home and everybody is staying close to, a dense population, everyone staying together. There was a rise in number of noise complaints, especially when people are working or, doing things, then you hear a lot of stamping or people playing basketball in the house. The noise complaints went up quite a bit. Especially during the COVID period.
Okay. As a follow-up question on taking photos for evidence, will it be invading someone's privacy if I take photo evidence?
Well, you have to take the right photos.
Exactly. It depends what kind of photos you're taking.
Yeah. I mean, you can't, take the photo from the common corridor and take inside, right? And I mean, if you are filming the outside of your door and somebody walks by and is dropping something, then that's not invading the privacy because it's about your own, right? So it really depends on whose photos you're taking and how you're capturing them.
Thank you.
Mm.
I'm just going to take this very last one.
Mhm.
Again, this, I think you could spend a whole hour on this one, but maybe summary. So what is the law on private property where someone is not maintaining their property
Mhm.
and maybe the plants come onto my side of the property
Mhm.
or a tree may fall onto my side of the property? What is the general law on this?
Okay, so actually the CDRA does provide that where there's interference with property, it is a basis for going under the CDRA. But actually, if it comes over to your property, you can actually cut it because it's in your property. If a tree falls over, it actually, you have to ask, is it the neighbor's tree or NEA's tree or NPark's tree? Right? It all depends on where the tree comes from.
Correct.
Or even LTA or whatever. So it depends on where the tree comes from, right? But if it is a neighbor's tree that falls over into your property, then you do have a right to go after that neighbor. But actually, the best is called NParks because the arborist will come and tell you, and then they'll go and knock on the right doors and so on.
But if the tree is bearing fruits in your side of the property, then
You get the fruit.
just take the fruits.
Yes, you do. You do.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, we are sadly out of time. And I would like to just invite each of our speakers to leave us with one key takeaway.
Sure.
Sunil, you want to go first?
Sure. I think a lot of these things comes from communication, and communication is key, amongst people. If you communicate with your neighbor at the initial stage in a right way, in an amicable way, it goes a long way towards resolving any dispute and nips the problem in the bud. However, if it doesn't, then of course, or communication breaks down or communication doesn't happen, then consider mediation at Community Mediation Center if you have an issue with your neighbor or community member. And when you come for mediation, there again, the esteemed mediators are trying to resolve the matter by building up communication between parties, So what I find through my years of experience is that communication is quite critical towards having good neighborly relationships.
Leighton?
So I would say we do live in a very congested place. We do live in very close proximity to each other. But at the same time, we also want to protect ourselves, protect our children, protect our home. So when it comes to disputes or problems that occur in your home that make you feel less like it is your home, recognize that it's actually hitting very hard for you. Recognize that it could be intentional, but most times it's actually not. And most times it's actually just thoughtlessness. And recognize that sometimes you're not the right person to actually deal with the problem. So seek advice first, because there are lots of people out there who are willing to try and help you. So that first approach is very, very important. And if you feel that you're not in the right place to actually do and initiate the first approach, there's nothing wrong with asking for help, right? So I think we all have to be realistic. We don't all live in homes where we can make each other butter cake and everybody's happy, because that doesn't always happen, right? So just recognize that there are lots of people out there who are willing to think of different ways to assist you. And one of the first ports of call actually is the CMC.
Thank you. So sadly, we do have to bring our session to a close. We've had a really great discussion. Tomorrow, we will be presenting divorce matters and concerns, custody, care and control. Are you contemplating divorce under civil law, but unsure about the legal and psychological aspects of it? Or perhaps you don't know where to start or where to seek help. So this and many more webinars as part of our Law Awareness Weeks at CDC 2023. You can scan the QR code or visit the website go.gov.sg/LAWCDC 2023 to register for this webinar or the many more webinars available. If you are facing any legal inquiries and are keen to register for a legal clinic session, you may write to help@probono.sg, help@probono.sg. Now, at the end of the webinar, a survey form will pop up on your screen for your completion. We would really appreciate any comments that you would have in order for us to improve future webinars. So I would like to express our gratitude to Sunil and Lei Teng. Thank you very much for sharing all of your knowledge and experience with us. And with that, we would all like to thank all of you for joining us today and your time, and have a good rest of the evening. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Philip.